Detroit just learned a lesson it never expected to receive. A corporation that assumed Canada would accept betrayal quietly just discovered the rules have fundamentally changed. General Motors made what may be the most catastrophic strategic miscalculation in its history, and the consequences are reshaping power dynamics across North American manufacturing. This story begins with a promise worth billions and ends with a nation that refused to be intimidated. GM didn't just abandon a factory. They abandoned workers who built their vehicles for decades, communities that organized their entire existence around automotive production, and a government that had funded their ambitions with taxpayer money. The corporation assumed Canada would simply accept this reality. They were wrong. October 21st, 2025 marked the moment GM's intentions became undeniable. The Cami plant in Ingersoll wasn't temporarily paused as workers had been told. It was permanently closed. Over 1,200 people lost their jobs. An entire community built around automotive manufacturing faced an uncertain future. Families who had weathered recessions, supply shocks, and economic downturns for GM received nothing in return for their loyalty. But GM fundamentally misread the country they were dealing with. This isn't the Canada that accepted corporate dictates without question. This is a nation operating with a new understanding of economic sovereignty and political leverage. And when Ottawa responded, the auto industry experienced something it had never encountered before. 3 days after GM announced the Cami plant closure, Canada deployed an economic weapon most corporations didn't know existed: the Auto Pact. Diminishment framework sounds technical, but its impact was devastating. Ottawa cut GM's duty-free import quota by exactly 24.2%. That reduction triggered a 25% tariff on every GM vehicle built in the United States and sold in Canada. The financial impact was immediate and brutal. A vehicle costing $45,000 to build in the US suddenly cost $56,000 the moment it crossed the Canadian border. Profit margins evaporated overnight. Canadian dealerships couldn't move inventory. Customers refused to pay inflated prices. Sales managers across the Midwest started demanding answers from corporate headquarters. Stellantis faced even harsher consequences. After shifting Jeep production to Illinois, their duty-free privileges were slashed by 50%. The message was unmistakable: break your commitments to Canadian workers and you lose your access to Canadian markets. This wasn't a political tantrum. It was precision economic enforcement. Canada essentially declared that corporations operating within its borders would be held accountable for the promises they made, and that accountability would be measured in the only language corporate giants truly understand: price. The roots of this confrontation stretch back to 2022 when GM pitched the Bright Drop EV program as a generational investment in Canadian manufacturing. Governments believed them. Workers trusted them. Billions in subsidies and support poured into the project. EV production was supposed to represent Canada's entry into the future of clean transportation. Reality arrived differently. GM claimed weak demand in April 2025 and implemented what they called temporary adjustments. Workers stayed loyal and waited. By May, the plant had completely stopped production. Summer passed with no communication from Detroit. Workers received no guidance, no clarity, no timeline for returning to work. When October arrived, the truth emerged. GM wasn't suspending production temporarily. They were abandoning it permanently. But while Detroit remained silent, Ottawa was preparing something far more precise. Minister Melanie Joly didn't improvise or threaten. She acted. Alongside François-Philippe Champagne, she issued a joint statement with zero diplomatic softening. GM and Stellantis had breached their commitments to Canadian workers. Then came the real shock. Official letters were dispatched to both corporations. Stellantis received warnings that their legally binding commitments were enforceable and clawbacks were being considered. GM was ordered to produce a concrete plan within 15 days, including a new vehicle model for Cami with firm production timelines. This wasn't symbolic political theater. This was economic policy weaponized with surgical precision. Workers were invited into negotiations. Executives were summoned to Ottawa. The message delivered in those meetings was brutally clear: restore your commitments or face permanent consequences. For the first time in decades, Ottawa held the leverage, and panic began spreading through Detroit boardrooms. GM executives started running simulations that reached the same conclusion: restarting production in Canada might actually be cheaper than weathering permanent tariffs. Every day the penalties remained in place, GM lost millions. European competitors faced none of these barriers and sold freely into Canadian markets. GM couldn't compete. Within 3 weeks of Canada imposing tariffs, Ford began reconsidering its Canadian manufacturing plans. Stellantis quietly replaced its Canadian CEO. GM reached out privately to Ontario officials to discuss returning to Ingersoll. Corporations that once treated Canada as an afterthought were suddenly calling Unifor, asking what they needed to do to repair the relationship. The balance of power had shifted. Canada proved it wasn't afraid to enforce its own rules, and every global corporation with operations in Canada started paying very close attention. This wasn't just about one plant or one company. This was about rewriting the fundamental relationship between Canadian workers, American corporations, and the future of North American manufacturing. Detroit assumed Canada would always be subordinate in that relationship. Canada just proved them wrong.